Are you interested in learning about Tantra? To know what is the Tantric essence and the fundamental Tantric approach to life? In this episode, I'll be discussing how to work with desire from the Tantric way, our relationship to pleasure, and some of the practices associated with the Tantric path. Now, I want to share a little bit about the history of Tantra to give us an understanding of the historical and philosophical underpinnings, but I don't want to get too lost in it. That's not the intention of this episode, to be thorough in the exploration of its history. I want to get to the practices and the things that can bring about direct experiences of truth. But let's do a little bit of an exploration into the past to understand where Tantra comes from. It became a prominent philosophy in India in about the 5th and 6th century, though it has roots even further back. The purpose of Tantra is self-realization, enlightenment. It is a fundamentally non-dual philosophy, meaning it goes beyond right or wrong. It does not separate the ego and the world with the heavenly abode or God. They are all one. So in this way, it comes with sharp contrast to some of the more dualistic philosophies that say heaven is after this birth, or there is a process of enlightenment and you become enlightened after a certain point of attainment. Now I want to pause here because I'm speaking about Tantra in a general way, and that leaves a lot of error and confusion because there's no way to actually speak about what is Tantra, because it is such a varied subject. As with any complex system, take Christianity, there are billions of people practicing some form of it, from the Catholics to the Christians to the sects that go down and drink ayahuasca and sing Christian hymns. So when we speak broadly about any general category of people, we lose the specificity and we lose the nuance. So I'm speaking very broadly about many things, and the essence of Tantra is contradiction. So there's going to be confusion when speaking about Tantra. So I'll just plant that there and we'll see if it comes up later. Now, the fundamental early practices of Tantra were meditation, visualization, and mantra. From this non-dual perspective, practicing for self-realization. And there's many different types of Tantra: white Tantra, black Tantra, red Tantra, and these refer to the various different aspects of practice. Some are you communing with the God source within you through your own practice and ritual, through your meditation, even through your own self-pleasure. Others work with other individuals. Other practices are much more akin to like black magic, voodoo practices, these kinds of things, yeah? There's a lot that goes into a vast philosophy and its practice. Because of its non-dual nature, because of its openness, the Tantric way is often to say yes to life. I often say that the mantra of Tantra is yes. And what I mean by this is because they are fundamentally non-dual and they see the Godhead can be found in all things, everything can be a vehicle for realization. They're a type of people who are open to do all kinds of things, whereas other religions and systems may close themselves down towards certain pathways, for example, sex being a prominent one that most people are aware of, as a vehicle for self-realization. A Tantrika is very much open to this. But there have also been many examples of Tantrikas who take things very far, and become very controversial. I have read that back in the day, many Tantrikas would live in and around cemeteries and dig up dead bodies and do quite explicit acts with these sexual acts, drinking of fluids acts, all kinds of things, because they're breaking convention. They're breaking it with a certain intention for self-realization. There's something that happens when there's a taboo among society and culture. The understanding, in some sense, from a tantric perspective, is that there is no right and wrong. So, an individual may go beyond the collective consciousness and what is so built into the conditioning of the system and find God there. And through doing this, through acts that are seen by many abhorrent, they experience a kind of freedom and liberation from the conditioning. So, certain individuals have taken this very far. Some individuals are a little bit more careful or just less exploratory. This is why a lot of tantric practices have had a very bad rap in history. Even today, the tantric sects, the people who are associated with tantric sects often have a bad reputation, and I may talk a little bit more about that field as we get more into neo-tantric practices. So fundamentally, we have a non-dual philosophy that is a saying yes to life, to find God in all things. Many of the traditional practices were, as mentioned, meditation and mantra and visualization. But then things evolved, as they do. Tantra spreads to different regions, and as religions and systems spread to different they begin to dance with, marry, and meld with the local traditions, just as Buddhism spreads from China and goes to Japan and becomes Zen, and Buddhism goes to Tibet and we get Tibetan Buddhism. Christianity spreads around and it gets all these different flavors. So too with Tantra. Tantra spreads and there's many different aspects, and today we have what's called neo-tantric practices. Now the neo-tantric practices have very much shifted in some sense from its origins in being mostly meditation practices to being what I'll term intimate practices around intimacy. You may be familiar with eye-gazing rituals and various different massage, touch, and breathing exercises that couples can do with one another. These practices are helping individuals to better connect with one another, with themselves. Intimacy. Into me I see, into you I see. There's a similar vein in that it's a non-dual philosophy, and there's a similar vein in that these practices help us to release the bondage of conditioning that has been carried from generation to generation, that says many things, perhaps, that pleasure is wrong, pleasure is sin. This is a lot of what the modern tantric sex community is working beyond. The roots, for example, in Western society of the Victorian age and the ages where people became very judgmental in and around sexual acts due to what the church was saying. And there is a certain reclaiming of sexuality as pure, as sacred. And this has its good essence, and it has its bad essence, and in a tantric way, they are all one. But it's still okay to talk about polarities in Tantra. We don't simply do away with all labels. We just don't stop at the limitation of the label. The relative relationship of polarities is still important. This creates contrast, awareness, This has many good things. It's not nonsensical, but there's a looking to what is and what is beyond. It's not this or that, it's this and that and that and that. So Tantra wants us to know our true nature. And it wants us to know it through the experience of the world, of Prakriti, the manifest world of form, and to know ourselves as Shiva, as pure consciousness. And it recognizes that there are limitations to our capacity for this gnosis, this self-knowledge through our conditioning. So very much the tantric essence is to say yes to life, not to say no in the sense where we have one path and we become dogmatic. Now, it's not that a tantrika can't say no. That's not what I mean by the mantra of Tantra is yes. There is consent and there's a deep recognition and tuning in within the self. But the yes, the saying yes, is this openness, perhaps more openness than most other walks. If we can even call it a walk, it's often known as the pathless path because most paths are linear. There are built systems, checkpoints, and teachings and teachers. There are 8 limb paths, and there's 8-fold ways, and there's marks of attainment along the path. And in these ways, you have a system you get to follow, like a martial art who gets belts, who can monitor their progress. Whereas very much in the tantric essence, instead of having a goal and a path, it is a pathless path because there is no goal. Do away with that. Instead of finding God at the end, find God now. Not to be found after enlightenment, whatever you know of this, but to be penetrated into this very moment and realize this is everything. Nothing more to seek. This is the pathless path, and it has a lot of confusion because so much of goal orientation is in the mind. Mind loves goals. Mind is always thinking of new goals beyond the moment, out of this present reality and in time. It creates a goal, it creates time. Forever people are in their thought and mind, yeah? It is a modern thing as well as an old thing, but very much a modern thing. So consumed in thought, very rarely just present, with consciousness, with breath, with love. This for me is the triangle of Tantra. Consciousness, breath awareness, breath practices, and love. Mind is in time thinking of one goal and desire to the next, judging if these desires are good or bad. This is not necessarily the Tantra way. It has a radical capacity to be present and to flow with life, which is very similar to Taoism. And it's in tune with Taoism in that there has been a lot of openness towards sexual practices and sexual cultivation. And the Taoist philosophies, such as the yin and yang theory, are very much harmonious with the tantric way. In the Taiji, in the yin and yang symbol, we have the dark and the light, maybe representing good and bad. You know, there's many different polarities we can place there. But it is not simply that there is one and the other. There is a little piece of the white and the black and the white. This shows on the mutual arising, the mutual interdependence between these things, not the separation, but the greater unity within the circle and a capacity to find harmony. And it recognizes the dance of polarity, like Shiva and Shakti. An individual can veer very much into one polarity. This may be represented in a time of their life when they go very austere. They are fasting, they are celibate, they are away from society, they are in meditation. And then they come back and maybe they are feasting. They are having sex. They are enjoying the pleasures of life. And then they are walking the middle path. They are doing them both in moderation, There's no right or wrong way, and there's a freedom to explore all these ways. Whereas a set way or system will often say, in our tradition, we are celibate. We do not have sex for this and this reason, and so on and on. You see this? There's a set way of doing things, and there's an openness to explore things for different times, as so long as they are relevant in the moment. In the moment, you can never know. It is an authentic arising, and it creates a certain radical honesty within individuals, and this is palpable when you're with these kinds of peoples, because there's a freshness to them, like a coolness almost. There's a spontaneity, an authenticity that shows you that they are alive and in the moment, less in the program and the patterning. You don't know what they're going to say because they're not so much a pattern. And there's a boldness these individuals have to carry because they are not in control. What I mean by that is they are not in control of the authentic arisings from the perspective of the ego mind, material mind structure. They are surrendering to the impulse. I have known it in my own life. I have gone through what I have expressed earlier with the austerity, with the fasting, with the penance, and I'm like, this is who I am. Maybe I'll be a monk now. There's a going all in. This is the tantric yes. It's the full fuck yes to do something and to do it totally with a kind of beautiful abandon into it, and also a recognition that it might not be forever. And in that, there's a necessary ingredient of surrender and humility to go into something and share that with the world, and then to change paths. And for many, this could be seen as someone couldn't keep in integrity, you know? We have these judgments in our society about marriage. You have pronounced to love this woman for the rest of your life, and now you have left them. You are not a man of your word. But this is life. A tantric perspective would be, that's okay. There's not a judgment when things change. And it's not saying, don't commit. Please understand once again that I'm not speaking for all of Tantra. Tantra has so much contradiction in it. But one perspective is that you can go so deep into a path, and if that's what's authentic in you in that moment, if the outpouring is there to commit to somebody for the rest of your life and then it doesn't work out, then that's the next inspiration through which to follow. The path isn't meant to be linear. It's the pathless path. It's not going anywhere. Now, individuals can walk the straight and linear path, and they can become a tantrika, and they can fall off that path and come back on it. I think this is the way. You may be a monk for 1 lifetime or 2 lifetimes, and then you may come and be a tantrika and explore many things. And then you may go back to the straight edge path. I don't see it as needing to have consistency in the linearity. There is a greater call to surrender to what is relevant for the soul to experience, rather than trying to cling to an idea that was perhaps so far in the past that that individual, the very individual who said those things, has completely shifted. All of our cells overturn themselves, and the numbers are always coming back different. Let's say 7 years, but it doesn't matter if it's 10 years or 5 years or 2 days. We are always changing. So how can we expect to carry the same thought forms if we don't have a single cell in our vehicle that is the same? And I mean, if you can, that's great. But if you can't, why is there any judgment for the shifting and changing? This is what sustains our world. There is a certain vein that is tradition, and the people who uphold traditions, and they uphold them with great sincerity, the systems and the paths, and there is an importance to this, and I deeply honor and respect those individuals for how they hold it, their sincerity, their seriousness with the way of tradition, because we don't, in some sense, want to lose that knowledge, right? It's very sacred knowledge. It's very important to our past. It may be useful in the future, and it may be useful for those continuing on in those traditions. And there is an impulse of creation. I'm not even saying of the individual, of creation, the creative force that says this is the path, the linear path and pattern, the tradition, and this is what is going to be, created onto it, off of it, as an offshoot of it. There's mutation, there's chaos added to that, and there's evolution through that process. So we'll always have some percent of the human organism, meaning the collective of all humans, and even the collective of what we are as a collective consciousness, that is going to be represented in a more divergent pathway in the tantric path. And then that individual who was operating as a tantric being may go into being one of the more linear associated traditional beings for a set period. Does this make sense? So let's talk a little bit about pleasure. Now, pleasure in relationship to, we could term it the lower three chakras, associated with financial abundance, with pleasure, with sexuality, and with power. Most of the spiritual traditions, most of them, I would say all of them, have very much a lot to say about these things. And there are many traditions who are quite open to working with sexuality in moderation, and there are some traditions which are more in alignment with things like abstinence or celibacy. It's a polarity, right? You're going to have people on the very far end of both spectrums and people in the middle and everywhere in between. The tantric way is very much saying yes, so moderation can absolutely be there. Abstinence for periods can absolutely be there. Celibacy, and also on the farthest far end of exploration, yeah? So especially in the neo-tantric movement, the tantric ways and practices have become prominent in our society and around the world for having various different practices. And once again, there's a polarity of more tame ones to on the far end of the spectrum of explorations of kink and all kinds of deep sexual practices and processes and rituals that people can go into to further explore pleasure through the human vehicle and through the sexual act and things associated with that. Now, I have a tantric essence, and I always have. I can recognize this from a very early age in my life. And I've also been deeply associated with many lineages and traditions which have a more tame approach to sexuality, if even to go so far as to say encouraging of celibacy. So my associations with various shamanistic practices which encourage celibacy for when working with the plants and going on prolonged bouts of celibacy, and the higher level teachers who live almost always in these processes almost never have sex. So this is seen as, let's call it, virtuous or good. And then there are many yogic practices and Buddhist teachings and other traditional systems, Taoist, that are more conservative. And once again, the higher level realized beings in these traditions often are renunciates, or they have very conservative views on sexuality. So this is consciously and subconsciously in my field as a value, as a way of being that is most respected in these traditions. And as I mentioned, having a tantric essence and taking part in many different practices, there have been different periods in my life when I'm open more to explore pleasure. But I have noticed in recent years, there's been a leaning towards these more conservative practices, particularly for the, that's a little bit too bold, but I'll just say generally the last few years, there's more of a leaning towards abstinence, towards celibacy. And this has been an important time in my life. I've been out of a committed relationship for years and been in deep spiritual process. And I'm coming to the end of that, is my sense, and there will be a prominent relationship in my life. So I'm reaching this transition point. And I noticed, even though I have a deep tantric essence and I have done a lot of exploration and healing and deconditioning of old patterns associated with guilt and shame around sexuality and pleasure, that taking part in these traditions, I subconsciously and consciously took on many of the value systems of these traditions, and I became much more conservative, and my relationship to pleasure began to shift, and even my relationship with my body, I mean, that goes hand in hand, began to shift as I disconnected. Now, once again, I mean, not once again, but this is not necessarily the teachings of the practices, the aforementioned systems that I mentioned. This is my relationship to them. So I'm taking responsibility for my actions and my relationship to these. And I'm not saying what happened to me reflects what the teachings and systems are doing, yeah? But I grew out of relationship with my body, and it felt easy to do so because of what I was surrounding myself with. So when an individual goes into these practices, depending on their tutorage, if they have teachers and how close they are with those teachers, they can talk with them about this. I didn't have too much of that, though that was present. So the things that were coming up for me, I didn't have a great exploration of. So the pattern that I developed was to really disconnect with the pleasure center of my body, the second chakra, and much of the lower chakras in certain ways. And this became, it's a lack of integration. And there's a guidance system that we lose, that I'll speak more in the I position because I'm talking about me, pardon me. So I began to lose a lot of my guidance system intelligence because I wasn't tuning in to the vessel, towards the receptor of all information coming through my body mind, yeah? So as I disconnected, dissociated, or stopped listening to the arisings in my body, the desires for pleasure, I lost intelligence and guidance. And that energy, when it's not recognized and acknowledged, begins to run amok in the system, to just say it in a plain way. Because repression is the darkest because we're completely pushing it down. Suppression was more of what I would express it as, and at times it wasn't. For example, when doing a celibacy term, if my mind is in a really good place and I'm doing it for a devotional region, it's like the energy has an opportunity to refine itself. They would say Jing to Qi to Shen. It's like those lower base energies have an opportunity to alchemize, to create more subtle qualities of consciousness. The energy becomes refined to reach higher states. Now, if the practice is done right, that's great. If that energy isn't able to become to its more refined state, then it can produce imbalance in the system, leading to all kinds of, I would say, even perversions if left too much unacknowledged, to just having excess control in the system. So in my example, sexual energy builds in the lower centers. It's an energy. And if it's not being released, it's going to build congestion in the body mind. That's not going to allow the flow of energy and information through the subtle channels of the system. And this can manifest just as frustration in life. It could be, you could say like unacknowledged sexual frustration, which then triggers other frustrations. So it can simply contribute to other negative emotions. Yeah. So when I started coming back more and more to tantric practices, there was a way of acknowledging what was there at a deeper level and honoring it and exploring it. And this releases that guarding and any guilt and shame and psychic armoring that is preventing that energy from moving in the system. And for me, it took a thorough exploration of the tantric practices, and I'm so grateful for the Heart of Tantra and the tantric trainings and the people who've held space for me that I've been able to work with that have allowed me these opportunities. This is part of the reason why I wanted to share this, is that maybe other individuals are on a similar path. They're associated with a certain tradition, and that tradition doesn't speak enough to what to do with the sexual energy, with the pleasure desires. They're giving many teachings, how to meditate or how to practice this and that way, and there's not a deep enough dive or individual tutorage towards how to work with these things, because there are so many spiritual teachings nowadays that are out, and they're often called the secret teachings in Chinese medicine, the secret teachings of this, and many of the teachings of Tantra and spiritual practices were secret. And they were secret for many reasons, and one of them is because it's best to learn them from a teacher and to be guided on a regular basis and have a deep, intimate relationship with that teacher, which isn't how most people are learning nowadays. It's not how I'm learning. I have teachers, but it's not like I'm living with them and practicing with them daily and going deep in that kind of way, yeah? So I feel like it's so important for so many people, especially because of the amount of conditioning around pleasure and what to do with the desires of the body. This is, in almost every spiritual tradition, I can't think of one that wouldn't have a dedicated way of approaching and understanding desire, because it's fundamental to the existence of creation. This whole universe is God's desire, you know. The great mind had a thought, and the Big Bang was here, and the universe was created, and it's been thought after thought, which is desire after desire. In a very beautiful way, it is not our desires, but every desire we have is a desire of God. This is a very tantric way of speaking to things, yeah? And every desire has a kind of sacredness, and God has an incredible amount of kink in him, because even suicide and murder is a part of God's kink because it's his desire, yeah? And I know I'm using the term God and his, and these kind of things can be triggering, but I can say she, or I can say the Great Spirit. There are many different ways of speaking to what I'm talking about, so I hope people aren't getting lost in the terminology there. I'm quite colorful in my language because it's not confined to just speaking about the absolute in one term or fashion, so I hope you can still understand it when I speak in these different ways. So part of my understanding of Tantra and its relationship to pleasure is that there's a certain teaching in and around pleasure being pleasure, and you can have pleasure for pleasure's sake, and that's okay. And there's a certain teaching around there's a higher will for self-realization, for love and truth. And in service of this will, we can purify our lower desires and have their energy be an offering, like a devotional offering through our vessel for our own awakening. And I think both are valid, especially from the tantric perspective of saying yes. And of course, pleasure for pleasure's sake can be a little bit can get people lost for sure. So there's a certain sense of the responsible part of me that wants to offer the other path as being more in alignment. At least I can say it's in greater alignment with the way that I desire to move through the world and what I desire to share with individuals, because it can be easy when we get lost in pleasure for pleasure's sake and we begin to do the deconditioning of what was told to us, the guilt and the shame and the releasing that, and then acknowledging that we can come into pleasure, but we can also lose ourselves in our ego's addictions and the covert ways that our ego may seek to numb ourselves or to selfishly serve ourselves, which isn't actually producing what I understand to be the tantric way of finding realization, not to get lost in prakriti, into the world of five sense reality, in the sense of clinging as a hungry ghost to continuously fill ourselves without reaching fulfillment and satisfaction. I don't think that's the fundamental center of it all. There's a way to be in your center of drinking in the triangle of Tantra, of breath and love and consciousness, which isn't contingent on any external circumstance. And when we're centered in that place, everything is the vehicle for self-realization. If we're in the ego of separation, this is not non-dual. This is dualistic, and we're trapped in that, and every pleasure and fulfillment, we can call it Tantra, call it what you will, it's not getting towards that end. So there's a importance of the way in which neo-tantra and tantric practices are offered in their sacredness and in their understanding to allow people to come to fulfillment and to find, this is the original way of utilizing meditation and practice of devotion to first center one's mind and then to go into the world and to some sense, reclaim it as sacred, taking the profane into the realm of the sacred, depends on our consciousness in order to do so, which has a certain refinement of our energy. And just as a opinion, that's not always found in our tantric practices nowadays, and this is why it has, for many good reasons, a bad rap, yeah, because of the way that people are losing themselves in pleasure, because of the way that we've repressed pleasure in the past, and now individuals hear of a movement where people are open to it and they simply want the pleasure. I feel this is very important because of, sharing a little bit about my past of going through periods of celibacy and austerity to find, in as best as I can and insofar as I can, my rooting in the Great Spirit with connection to my soul, of finding fulfillment outside of five sense reality. And from that grounds, having an opportunity to, after many years, come back into the realm of pleasure with a greater center. So, in as best as I can, I don't lose that center as I go out into the world. And what came up as I started doing tantric work after years of being in the more celibacy phase, and it's not like it wasn't complete black or white and I was completely celibate all those years. There was still tantric meanderings, if you will, but there was a dominance, as I mentioned, towards the practices, systems, and teachings that were a little bit more austere and linear. In coming back, I had to acknowledge that I had a lot of fear around previous addictive patterns of my relationship with pleasure, with substance, with sex. And I had to acknowledge that that is within the realm of possibility, and to go back into it says yes, and I trust myself. I feel I am in integrity with my word, and if ever I did lose myself, just as I can lose myself into all kinds of addictions, between food addictions and thinking addictions, in a moment's notice I can be lost in my thoughts, and that's a small addiction in some sense when I'm avoiding something, yeah? So I recognize that it's okay because I have enough of a grounds in my center, in a community, in accountability around me. There's an increased willingness to go into these things because of what I have created in and around myself, yeah? And this is an important factor in it all, is that commitment to the spiritual path and the accountability around, so that the exploration of pleasure, which has so rooting, like there's so much unconsciousness, whereas it can be conscious, and in a moment's notice, a lapse of consciousness, and it slips in a downward spiral vortex process, and something comes up, yeah, it triggers something within us. So the amount of exploration I go into, it has a relationship with my consciousness, with my groundings in my other meditation practices and process, and my accountability and the containers I'm stepping into, and the consciousness of the individuals around to recognize these things, to hold space for the individuals like myself. And my relationship with pleasure is changing. It's changing, and it's the first word that came to mind was it's kind of shocking, because I have lived in a way where pleasures, there's certain desires for certain things in my life, and it feels like in a moment's notice, but some of these are more of a gradual process that things shift. For example, I have a desire to have children. This was not a prominent thing in my life in my 20s. I wasn't thinking about this. And then all of a sudden there's this desire, and it's a beautiful desire. Going away from being in an intimate relationship in a committed container in a really beautiful way has been, what am I trying to say here? It's like coming and stepping out of it and being on the metaphorical mountain for quite some time and coming back into it. There's a cleansing of my desires, and there's a different intention. So what I crave for in intimacy comes from a different place when I'm looking now for an intimate partner to be the mother of my children. It's a completely different energy than just looking for sex so that I can have pleasure and we can explore. That, for me, is part of the higher intention for self-realization. As I go deeply into my desire for children, it's not a selfish desire, and though the self is always a part of that, so there's always an aspect of selfishness. Having children, insofar as I understand it, is not easy. Yeah? It's very much me giving of myself, my freedom to have a kind of choice with how I spend my time and energy, and that's going to be devoted towards another being that I have the honor of stewarding, who is its own soul and who is, on some sense, my own child, but in some sense, the child of the universe. And I'm just I like the word steward, just helping support this being. And this is a much different quality of desire as just a sexual desire for pleasure and pleasure alone, yeah? And my desire for this, because of how arduous I have heard it is to have a child, it's not for the limited moments of pleasure, it's for the soul's growth. That's what pulls me in. There's a recognition and acknowledgement that this is good for my own self-realization, and this is the intrigue. In the yogic world, they talk about the householder tradition versus the renunciate. The renunciate is the one who is a monk, who renounces the world. And then the householder is the one who holds the house, who has children and a married life and takes part in the working world. And there's different teachings in yoga, in tantra, etc., for individuals who are householders versus renunciates, because their lives are completely different. Their level of practice and the time that they can spend in meditation will be different. And part of this is, for me, the understanding of traditional tantric practices of meditation. A householder will have time and space for those. And they will be doing a lot more of what we call the neo-tantric practices of intimacy, because of the relevance for that type of practice in the container of their lives. Whereas a renunciate isn't going to need to do these kinds of rituals and practices because they're not relevant for their path, yeah? So when we understand our spiritual path, and once again, if we're a tantrika, we may be a householder and become a renunciate at some point. We surrender to the great spirit that moves through. But the tantric practice has this openness for the householder, and many of these neo-tantric practices are aimed at how does an individual live in soul recognition as a householder. So you realize your God nature as expansive as the infinite, as having a grounds in both the material and the immaterial world, and to integrate this information as a mom or a dad in the work world, as a banker, or with whatsoever you do, yeah? So this is a very important, in my opinion, teachings and practices for our modern world, who more and more people are waking up to this true nature through the efforts of many individuals carrying this light, and the teachings of many different systems, practices, plant medicines, etc., which are waking people up to their true nature. And yet still so much conditioning from the path that prevents us from living a full life, living a fulfilled life, and living a fulfilled life through an open exploration of pleasure and power and money and the conditioning around these things, so that we can live in recognition of the greater acknowledgement of who we are, as well as being aware of our planet and the interrelationships of all things. How can we more boldly say yes to our true nature and to walk this pathless path, this tantric path? Because teachings are medicine, teachings are thought forms, they're technologies, and there's particular relevance for different teachings at different times. Great example is Confucianism was a much more conservative way of being and relating in China. And this was prominent for a period, and then Taoism came along as this more feminine, chaotic, very similar to Tantra, and that's what the people needed at that particular time. And this too is why Tantra and Taoism are coming more and more into the West, because it's good medicine for most of the people here. So too, I teach a type of breath work which is more balanced and even further on the swing of surrendering, feminine, and letting go, because most of Western society is more yang and doing and effortful, and we praise the effort. We love the individual who does and does and does, and the entrepreneur, and yet this, and I won't go deep into this, is causing a lot of malady and excess and overuse and over-efforting, which is leading to a certain depletion and obsession with growth rather than maintenance and balance. So part of the reason why I share that teaching of breath work is to offer that energy, that technology towards our society and culture to encourage us to slow down. And this isn't to say that yang style breathwork and more practices of effort and doing aren't still relevant, you could say even necessary and advantageous. But in the yin and yang theory, we look to see where we are in the polarity of things being more yang and yin, and what do we need to do to find harmony. Because if we go too far into one polarity for too long, we can lose touch, we can develop an imbalance of some kind, and this may be represented in the individual or in the society, and ultimately this isn't going to be for our best good if we continue to follow the path that is leading us away from our center, which is the place of harmony between yin and yang. So there's a constant balancing or oscillation that we make to find regulation and come back to our center. Yeah, I work with individuals in these ways, and I'm not I don't tout myself as an explicit tantric practitioner, though I have taken tantric trainings. My yoga training was a tantric one. I have done separate tantric trainings. I use the word tantra because people understand it. It's in the culture, but the fundamental non-dual philosophy, it doesn't need the label of Tantra, and many of the practices that I work with are also Taoist practices and from other systems that have a similar recognition and acknowledgement. But I help individuals with breath work, which is in essence a tantric practice in the ways that I've expressed it, yeah? With the triangle of love, consciousness, and breath, and the intimate union that is possible with the individual, us as the ego, body, mind complex, and the great spirit. The inhale is the opening, saying yes to life. The exhale is the surrendering, like masculine and feminine, Shiva and Shakti. There's a fundamental tantric text called the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra, and it lists 112 meditations that are offered for self-realization. And it's not you need to practice all 112, but these are all doorways into self-realization. And some fundamental ones are conscious connected breath work and understanding the relationship between inhale, the transition between exhale, and then the cycling, the eternal looping of breath, which is our true nature of living with every breath and dying with every breath. And as a holistic coach, I'm open to exploring many different realms, from financial limiting beliefs to sexual guilt and shame to our blocks with power, so that individuals can optimize and harmonize their energy to live their dharma. Because this is what I have found: when we have a dream, we have a sufficiently beautiful and big dream, there's a pathway of evolution and energy towards that. And what holds us back is our blockages, our limiting and negative beliefs, which are often in the lower three chakras, which are associated with finances, sexuality, and power. So we have ways in which we sabotage taking on power because of the belief systems we have about powerful people, or how we shut down, just as I had, shut down and become pleasure averse, deny pleasure because of beliefs in and around. And those could be, in my circumstance, spiritual beliefs around what is good to have pleasure. But the closing down of pleasure, well, it was a source of depression in my system and unacknowledgement of energy. And when there's suppressed energy in those ways, it will lead to imbalance, yeah? As well as money blocks and these kind of things. And these aren't just blocks in the mind, yeah? These are blocks that have a constellating nature in the emotional body, which is still in the energy matrix of who you are, the blueprinting of what eventually goes down into the physical manifestation of your form, your matter. So if there's blocks that are especially unacknowledged, repressed and suppressed, this can lead to very physical imbalances, tumors, and any number of health conditions. In Chinese medicine, we just call them imbalances, rather than often, giving them that label, which can often be a death sentence, a cancer or something like that. And they describe things in terms of their five elemental and yin and yang balance. For example, this individual has excess wood element here, and they're describing things in a very fundamental energetic level, rather than giving it a label which someone can identify with, that becomes an aspect of who they are. Does that make sense? I'm not going to go too deep into that, but just a little teaser into a really beautiful way of seeing imbalances in a way that doesn't necessarily hold that identification with it, as well as what comes with that. Outside of the conscious connected breath work that I mentioned, I teach many other styles and practices for individuals who want to explore these ways, eye gazing and these kind of things. I teach a particular pattern of breathing called orgasm breath, which is based on the expression of pleasure. And I teach it often, almost always, in a way where there's no touch and self-pleasure, though I offer individuals can do this on their own, in that we can express pleasure and tap into our innate pleasure center and system, and it to be the connection that we have to the orgasm that is all around us, to the pleasure that is present in the field, so long as we are willing to be with it and focus on it and cultivate that word cultivation, very key. Cultivate that within ourselves. It's like gratitude or contentment. It's always there, but it takes some cultivation to go into it. Writing out 108 beautiful things that you're grateful for, and then saying those and speaking those words and feeling the gratitude that evolves and is evoked through the repetition and exploration of the vehicle, through the sound technology of speaking those true and beautiful words and feeling the emotional resonance that rings out through you. Just like that, self-pleasure is possible through just the exploration of our sound and the different tones of our sounds and the ways in which we can express. And this is a deeply potent way to tap into your natural reservoir of pleasure, so that you can give from that place of a full cup, yeah? That's the idea, coming back, that pleasure for pleasure's sake can be quite addicting if we're seeking outside of ourselves. But if we have our innate tap into source, the ultimate resource of pleasure and ecstasy, then we can channel that through us, and we cannot be so depleted when we take part in those things, because there's not grasping and a need outside of ourself, exogenous. We're tapping into the endogenous supply, yeah? And also, so much of the conditioning around the expression of pleasure is there, and we get an opportunity to express all kinds of pleasure in an open way, that may have not been what we had been conditioned to in our early childhood, where we were masturbating quietly because our parents might have heard, or we've never perhaps had an opportunity to be really loud in our sexual acts and expression because of certain confinements of where we've been practicing those things, yeah? So offering individuals an opportunity as a practice and as a guided process to go into the exploration of the ways in which we can express pleasure. And this is part of how we actually invite in more pleasure, is to express it. And this is profound in how it can help you and your partner to feel more safe and open to express. Because oftentimes your expression of pleasure creates the field of openness so that they can express their pleasure. So it becomes a kind of practice that you do on your own, and then you can offer it to another individual. Some tantric practices are really boring, but they're meant to be boring, because they're only boring because the mind is so addicted to stimulation that it hasn't learned how to work with energy. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that, for example, in standing Qigong, you stand there, and one of the practices is learning to sink your qi out of your head, because most people live in their heads. They're constantly thinking, and this sends energy up to your brain. To sink the qi, the thoughts need to at least become quieted, if not still. When the thoughts become quiet, the energy can begin to sink down into the heart, into the felt sense, and down into the sensations of the body, and the energy will sink down into the lower dantian. It will do this in some sense naturally as we become more relaxed, but there are very particular ways of holding the body and standing that allow for the energies to circulate down there, and our consciousness and intention around this process is definitely a vehicle for how it works as well. But naturally, as you become more calm and relaxed, your breath and your energy will sink down into the lower belly, and the more up in your head and disembodied in your thoughts you are, the more the energies will go up to your head, and you'll be less in your heart and body, yeah? So when I say boring, I mean most people, if I tell them to stand alone in a room or in the forest, they will become bored, or they will just go into their default ways of being and relating to the world, which is often to be in thought process. So the boringness is the initial unstimulated nature, because the mind and its dopaminergic relationships with life are so used to having stimulation that has pleasure responses built in, that it can take some time to destimulate the nervous system tension and the default patterns of thinking and receiving stimulation, so that the energies, the consciousness of the individual can sink more into its center. Because thinking, in some sense, is discarnate, out of body, disembodied, and to constantly be in five senses is externally locating those senses, not so deeply entwined with the roots of sensation at the center of the soul, or deeper within the energy body at least. So it takes some time, process, and guidance often to have an individual to sink their energies from the head down into the heart and into the lower abdomen, and not just into the lower abdomen as in the physical abdomen, but into the lower dantian and the lower centers, so that the energy body begins to open up, giving them access to a whole, well, a vast world, more expansive than the external world of the universe that we know as the cosmos. And this, this is the threshold of moving beyond the boredom that I was mentioning and into a realm of non-dual awareness, because when you come into the recognition, the direct experience of energy, you'll realize very quickly that the boundary of your skin, which most people know conceptually is not a true boundary, but a porous structure. But when you experience energy, you experience yourself as one with the vibrational matrix that is the whole cosmos. So more and more, this is why the tantric practices, they're not just about the exploration of sex and pleasure through the five senses. If you're stuck there, it's very limiting, because you're not actually experiencing non-dual awareness as you're going into those things. That's a little bit what I was speaking to about when you're stuck in the ego mind, the separate self experiencing those. True experiences of non-duality and going deeper into the energy will give you authentic and direct experiences of non-duality while exploring pleasure. And this opens up all new doors and pathways towards your embodied realization of what it is to be a spirit manifest into form, and understanding yourself at the various layers of energy and density. So those are some of the ways that I help to guide people in the ways of Tantra. What I'd like to do now is do some reflections and just come to some of the key points that I've talked about in this episode. So my Tantra reflections are that the tantric essence is a part of us all, in that we are all tantric beings. We have everything within us. We have good and evil. We have, a nature that is our God nature. We have an ego nature. All things possible are within our potential, whether they're active in our form and consciousness in each moment depends on where we're focused, where the spotlight of our attention is. The tantric approach, I've said this, the mantra of Tantra is yes, and not to create confusion saying that, you're a tantrika, you can't say no to something. No, that's silly. That would violate our own sovereignty and others as well. It's yes because, the universe is an unconditional yes. This is God's nature as unconditional love. It's so loving and so vast in its ways that you can even believe that you are unloving. That's how loving it is. It allows you the infinite potential to believe whatever you want. And if you so choose, it's unconditional yes to all of your other desires. Coming back to that beautiful teaching, which I believe I heard from Kabbalah, is that it's God's desires moving through you, even your good and bad desires. So that lensing, that way of interacting with that says, no, this is beyond good and evil. So there's no longer the guilt and shame, because things are not so much just the act, but it's the guilt and shame, the intention and the energy behind it, which creates the pattern, the samskara of how it integrates into the system. Yeah. So the tantric approach to saying yes to life is an openness beyond system, beyond a certain set ways of interacting with things, and a capacity to be open towards contradiction and exploration of polarities, and the acknowledgement that we can walk a life and we can be a married man, and all of a sudden next we're a I was going to say something, but I'm not. Even in the controversy of Tantra, I still have discernment, and discernment is always going to be important. We can go along and we can take many different turns on our path, and this can be a beautiful thing. This is, after all, the pathless path of Tantra, in that the emphasis on so many other systems and traditions is the ultimate goal of self-realization or what so have you, and these are really beautiful. And it's not that you can't simultaneously walk these paths, as I am continuing to do in my life, and follow these systems, and yet there's an energy of being a part of them and not, walking with certain individuals in life and also having our own journey. So the pathless path completely shifts things if we integrate it into our system, because If you just walk the linear path, it's all about that goal, which is always in the future. And you can look at where you're at in your attainment and these kinds of things, and maybe never find full recognition and acknowledgement of the beauty of this moment, because you're always trying to get to what's next in your spirituality and in your business. And this, in my opinion, it's exhausting. It's not fulfilling. It's not a true softening into the moment to experience the pleasure of life, and it's trying to get to the next thing and not fully experiencing the triangle of Tantra. This is my idea there. I mean, I don't know if it's a truly original idea. It's nothing too profound. It seems kind of basic in some sense, but it's something I wrote a short book on: the heart and the breath and the consciousness of Tantra as being three fundamental elements towards a good way of interacting with these teachings. And the pathless path is open to pleasure, and it's open to many things that others will suppress and repress due to conditioning, money, power, these kinds of things. There's an openness to explore these things in a good way. There's many different warnings and cautions that I myself will give, and many others, on the tantric path, because the tantric and non-dual teachings are the most dangerous. Because it's easier to say, this is good, this is bad. Don't murder, murder is bad. That feels really clear. But then there's always a circumstance where it's like, we go over these in moral philosophy. Well, if you could, create some scenario where you could kill this one person and it saves 100 person, is it worth it? Da 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 da. And once again, going back to some essential teachings here, it's not the circumstance, it's not the simple act of it, it's the underlying intentions and the guilt and the shame, what really creates the mark on the individual and the karma of that act. So when things aren't black and white, which I don't believe they are, they're like the yin and the yang, there's always nuance to anything. And though as a blanket statement, the traditional teachings, the dualistic teachings of right and wrong, are a great starting point. In my understanding, they're meant to also be integrated with the non-dual teachings when the student, when the individual, or when the child is at a point where they can understand them. And that's going to be different for different individuals. So it's not this or that, it's this and that. That's the whole idea of the duality and the non-duality, as they're both complementary and mutually interrelated, just as yin and yang. You see that same kind of as above, so below, holographic form in so many of these things. So these kinds of teachings, we call them Tantra. I call them Tantra because it's easy to share it, because people recognize the term and have a general understanding, although there is more perhaps misunderstanding around Tantra nowadays, and maybe it's not the best term, but you know what I mean. But they're so similar to Taoism and many other philosophical and practical systems. So these are important in my understanding. These are important in our modern day for the modern people of the West and many other places, to help us to heal and find greater harmony within us, to integrate the perspective of duality and non-duality, to not strive for something beyond this moment and come into greater recognition and acknowledgement of the perfection of this moment. Ensure the never-ending unfoldment of your attainment and enlightenment in the highest goal. And yes, this moment, perfect. You already realize there's nowhere to go, and the capacity to have both of these. Because there's some people, once again, will use, I'm already enlightened, I don't need to go anywhere, and then justify all number of excuses and behaviors that aren't, in my opinion, the highest path of recognition of who we truly are. I'm not going to go deeper into that, but that's something fundamental, I feel. So one other piece I'd like to re-mention is the 112 meditations of the Vigyan Bharav Tantra. It's a beautiful book, and there's another rendition of it, or reflection of it, called the Radiant Sutras. Lawrence Roke, something along those lines. This is a beautiful, more poetic reflection to it, and very beautiful text, which I highly recommend anyone interested in getting to know Tantra, as well as the Book of Secrets, which is Osho's, who is a beautiful tantric teacher, though he wouldn't, I mean, he would and he wouldn't, I'm sure, call himself that. I don't want to speak for him. He has a beautiful book. It's a deep book. I think it's like 1,000 words or more, where he goes into each of the meditations and writes his reflections on it, which is what inspired me to write my book, The Heart and Breath of Tantra, where I do the same thing, but I only do, I think, 10 or 15 meditations. I only got past the draft stage of that book. But I wrote it, and it was a beautiful experience to go deep into it and to explore those meditations at a greater depth. One last thing I will mention, because I feel like it's important. Shiva is very associated with Tantra. Of the Trimurti, the Vishnu, who is the maintainer of life, and Brahma, the creator, and Shiva, the destroyer. Shiva very associated with Tantra, because I mean, Tantra is like, you've been doing one thing, okay, destroy that. Let's kind of metamorphosize and be a snake and come out of our old skin and be something completely new. Yeah, that's very much Tantra. It's like, oh, you've been a married man, you've been following Christianity, okay, time to take a twist, and that's the tantric essence. So I'll just not mention much more about Shiva here, otherwise I'll tangent on, and I feel like I'm coming into more of a conclusion. But Shiva, very associated, so working with the Shiva energy and working more into Shiva related practices will often be a great doorway into the tantric world. So I didn't mention a great deal of the history because I'm not so much a scholar in these arts. You know, there are some individuals who are very much scholarly. I am very much practical. I like the practices and the direct experience. And I learn the scholarly stuff in so much as I need to, because I'm coming up against the block, or I'm looking to teach something and I want a more comprehensive knowledge. So I don't find a lot of the history of Taoism and Tantra and many of the things that I studied that relevant for what I teach and know. And I'm not so much a person who likes to spend a lot of time reading. At the end of my day, if I have an opportunity for an hour to read or to practice meditation, I'm going to be in the meditation. So very rarely will I choose to read. So I'm not the best in terms of scholarly history, though I know more than what I've shared here. And there's a lot more to share, and there's a lot of valuable ways I could share and go into some of the philosophical underpinnings of the 36 tattvas and the different lineages of white, black, and red into greater detail, and how neo-tantra and what it all includes. Worthy exploration, no doubt, but yeah, take from that what you will. There's scholarly individuals, and there's what I call the tantric essence, and I believe we all have it in us, and those who have it in us, in them, and they're looking to explore it, they will recognize this within themselves, and the teachings of Tantra will begin to come alive in them. And I'm not saying you should say you're a tantric essence and begin to teach it without formal study with a teacher and these kind of things. I think that can go astray quite quickly. But the recognition that you are a tantric being and you have all the information within you as a truth. So there is a validity in that. And also, once again, with tantric teachings, there's always a caution. So this is very important. Increasing levels of discernment is always a part of the spiritual path, especially when we're coming out into the world with a technology, which is Tantra, these techniques which are powerful in their capacity for self-realization and awakening. But awakening is not easy, in the sense that awakening shatters the belief systems, the whole mental construct of the individual, which is the self in some level. And in order to emerge like the phoenix from the ashes, one has to die, and the dying process is death. It's not easy. There's grievance, there's process around it, there's a lot that goes into it. So if one wants to really go deep into deconditioning their own mind, it's best to have a proper support system of accountability. And if an individual needs to take some kind of leave from their work or something, this work is beyond the worldly ways. And our spiritual process, I can speak for myself, it doesn't care whether we have bills to pay. If you have a large awakening, you just have to deal with it. It's like having a divorce in life or having something big come up. It's not planned. I mean, it is planned perfectly, but it's not planned around your ego's convenience of what you want. So if you're on the path and you want to go deep into the practices in a developed way, this is just my recommendation, not a should, not a I know better, but encouragement for there to be good grounds for you to do so, and a good safety net, you could say, or a good foundation for you to take your next steps into spiritual process. And if you're just looking for exploration into Tantra, I'm not saying that this is going to necessarily spiral into a massive awakening that will shift you out of the foundations of your life, but you never know. So I want to be cautious in the words that I say, to do my best to offer things in a kind and gentle way, and not to rush people into anything vast or to overstep individuals beyond their capacity. I don't think that's in alignment with the tantric way, and it's not in alignment with what I like to offer individuals. Once again, what I could say is, if we're already where we need to be, there's no hurry to go to the next step. So a lot of the times ambition and trying to get to those next steps of enlightenment and get there is from an energy of perhaps not willingness to be where we're at, an avoidance of that. So with that, explore Tantra, and explore it with great consciousness and caution, with a reverence for, it's like courting death. You want to acknowledge the power of death, and also to have it be your lover, to dance with it. And in that way of union, there's a deep level of reverence and preciousness. And I think this is the level of devotion that is asked of an individual as they walk the tantric path, that increased level of awareness, communication, and discernment to relate in these ways, especially, if this is in a partnership or something where you're diving deeper and deeper into soul recognition with one another. It asks for an increased level of responsibility, communication, and connection, and a capacity to sustain the new standards of relating, which for many individuals, that's not what they signed up for when they just wanted more pleasure and sex. So enter into these practices with that level of devotion and discipline towards the path, and it will unfold as it does perfectly. Thank you for listening. This episode is complete. Aya Om.